A warrior's true discernment lies in his worst films of 2021. Sun Tzu, The Art of War. I had to make some big cuts this year. I would keep seeing things and be like, well, that's gonna be in my bottom 5, and then watch in horror as it slowly risked being left off the list entirely. Not that this was a particularly awful year, it just humbled my sense of assuredness. As usual, only movies I reviewed are eligible, and I don't bother seeking out every movie that looks awful. So if you're wondering where movies like Home Sweet Home Alone and Cinderella are, I didn't watch them, because why would I? Not about to waste any more time. Here's my worst movies of 2021, aka the 10 I hate more than the fucking Ben Shapiro movie. See, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Starting this list with Cruella at number 10 is kind of sad. This is how you know this trip we're going on will take us into godless territory. Emma Stone hamming it up is a little fun, but it's nothing compared to Glenn Close. And she's not really playing Cruella de Vil. She's another interchangeably irreverent anti-hero the studio is terrified of you hating, so in pure defiance of her legacy and impact as a character, Disney's taken measures to separate any and all of Cruella's agency from her status as a villain, which surely only made the character more interesting, right? Cruella's script is so lost for identity such that it ends up neither a complete prequel nor a reimagining, but still manages to execute the worst traits of both. It's shockingly bad how any callbacks to the original are implemented without concern for how they narratively interact with each other. There is an attempt at energy, again mostly because of Stone, but it's the rest of the film's insubstantial flashiness and unbearably fidgety soundtrack that swallows her efforts whole. So, to review, it disrespects the source material, is paced like a rabid animal on speed, has a sickeningly patronizing approach to character morality, and turns its self-made punk rock protagonist into a recipient of capitalist divine bloodline. And it's the best Disney remake to come out in years. Because of movies slated for 2020 getting pushed back to 2021, there was this explosive blockbuster backdraft in the first 6 months of the year. And all most of them did was encourage me to wonder how clueless a studio can be. How obvious can you make it that you don't understand what makes a franchise popular, when, bafflingly, the franchise name is the only reason you're making the movie? If the movie is Mortal Kombat, then the answer is very. The gore finally matches the content of the games, that's true. But name another aspect of this film that adapts the property instead of homogenizes it. When people say movies like these are for fans, this makes me believe they don't think very highly of themselves. What part of this movie do you believe was made for you? Was it the original protagonist the writers came up with for this movie with a theme song that literally lists more interesting characters than him? There's this air of shame whenever the tattered script includes a fight scene with how quickly they enter and exit the film, which is not always what you want from a Mortal Kombat movie. But Liu Kang does the dragon thing, and then you're suddenly accused of nitpicking by 100,000 people in desperate need of a shower, even though the story's dog shit. The funniest thing about Halloween Kills is how overbearing its ideas are next to how little it cares to follow through on them. Except their ideas aren't any good, the acting meant to communicate them is terrible, and the baser elements of a slasher film around those things aren't clever or scary or structured. They're blunt and rushed. Which the studio clearly knew, because what this movie actually isn't in the trailer. It makes this look like just another adequately safe Halloween sequel like the last one, something I'd happily have gotten instead. I know it's healthy for franchise movies to take risks every once in a while, but the same process of wondering if something's a good idea still has to apply. But it's more than that. Halloween is well acquainted with bad sequels, which is to say the nature of the first movie doesn't invite continuation to begin with. But outside the Rob Zombie ones, none are this poorly shot, acted, and written. Curse might be worse than this, actually. But Kills is always hitting you with its repetitive and clunky dialogue and cinematography catered to the one guy out there who's just gotta know how many wrinkles are on Anthony Michael Hall's face. How does a franchise that's gone on this long end up releasing a movie in modern day that might be the worst out of all of them? It certainly feels like an eternity since girl boss became a term we just had to live with being around, but wasn't that just last year? Or maybe it was longer and I'm just out of touch, either's possible. I sincerely doubt I Care a Lot started it, but its online reaction was my first exposure to the word. It's so irritating this cheapo Netflix movie tried ascribing to a level of moral complexity, and then, I'm convinced by design, manufactured the divide between cautionary subtext and toxically gendered affirmation seen in the cultural imprint of movies like Fight Club. These are just terribly constructed, gimmicky characters who are impossible to root for, but the film community was inexplicably desperate to make sense of. It just makes more sense that a Netflix original would have a miserable plot and cast of characters because the script is just bad. Every conversation about I Care a Lot should have been followed with another one about whether or not we'd just put more thought into the movie than the writers did. Consider this movie to also represent my annoyance with Netflix originals' general cheapness, abundance of cliches, and indistinguishable production value from typical VOD trash elevated into the mainstream by actually relevant movie stars. That could easily apply to Stowaway, or Woman in the Window, or movies I didn't even bother to see. But the phenomenon needed a patron saint, and I Care a Lot may as well be Netflix's Mother Mary. When a person neglects the cleanliness of their home and an aroma starts to build up, the person living there can't usually detect it. This is because they've worked up a tolerance, leaving the next poor soul to walk in there wondering if they use recycled sweat to clean the windows. So, you tell me. Has Dear Evan Hansen always been this unbearable mirror into Ben Platt's ego, or am I only noticing that as someone introduced to the show now? The audacity of casting Platt as Evan in spite of everything so obviously wrong with doing that has been bouncing around in my head like the DVD logo for months now. But even without that, this show seems like a case of creators telling one story convinced they're telling another. Evan is so socially compromised he gets caught in a feedback loop of guilt and not having the right words to force himself out of it, something that's incredibly tragic and disturbed, which gradually becomes insulting as I'm told how uplifted I should be by this stupid firefest of mental health pomp. You wouldn't hand a Paul Schrader script to Richard Curtis, and yet this is a comparable mistake in execution. The whole film is completely rushed as well to accommodate Platt's ever-changing Michelin Man face from getting any older. The production design and choreography are lazy beyond comprehension for a big-budget film. The only possible draw to this adaptation is Ben Platt. No other aspect is adapted with any care. You just have to like Ben Platt in the role that much. And I think the only person who fits into that category is Platt himself. I want all of you to apologize to Cats. Apologize to Cats right now. Its characters may have been made into Lovecraftian horrors with CGI, but Dear Evan Hansen didn't even need CGI. Oh boy, here we go. This might be controversial to say, but I think so long as you really, really pick your battles, it's okay to dismiss people's media literacy and critical sensibilities based on a single outlier of abandoning intellectual common decency. Character attacks aren't usually right, but some things just have no rhetorical permutation of defense. With that out of the way, as they subject us all to their prolonged temper tantrums about things not going their way, bullying everyone around them while playing victim, and harassing studios via digital Chinese water torture into making slightly different corporate garbage that just happens to appeal to their stillborn impressions of artistry, it's time we embrace the truth that Snyder fans just like bad things. They like bad storytelling, they like bad characters, and bad writing. Justice League: The Snyder Cut is a movie that actively makes me furious. And believe it or not, I'm actually cutting it some slack. Somewhere in Snyder fans' programmed dialogue tree is that we just want to hate his movies. Which, no, you got it backwards. This isn't on the list because I wanted to hate it. If my list was motivated by how much I wanted to hate a piece of pop culture, this would be number 1, with a Herculean distance between it and second place. I cannot believe how hard people petitioned for this, as if the quality of the film would matter to them when it came out. the movie is still a 4-hour diseased tumor of self-importance slop that would still be on here if it weren't for the fan base. But it's really the collective pretending the online campaign was out of genuine concern for an artist's vision and not some malformed act of coordinated mob mentality that would simply insist whatever we got was genius that urges me to write longer sentences than I probably need to out of frustration. As much as I hate M. Night Shyamalan's movies, it's notable that with one airbender-shaped exception, all his properties aren't based on anything, or are so far removed from the source material they may as well not be. I should be praising his originality, but Shyamalan's ideas all being original just makes me wonder what kind of mind would come up with something like Old. Sometimes a little storytelling baggage is just part of the hand you're dealt with series and franchises, but knowing every mistake in Shyamalan's films is by his overconfident design makes them worse. Try as I might, I cannot respect the badness of his work. The people who laugh at his movies in a so bad they're good way possess a level of self-awareness about his films Shyamalan does not possess himself. And for the longest time, I've been unable to laugh along with them, trying to wrap my head around what makes him different. And I think I found out why. For one thing, he genuinely believes he's emulating Hitchcock and approaches criticism like a humorless slug. So enigmatic as his films might be sometimes, anything funny about them is unintentional. He's not riding a razor's edge. Old is meant to be taken seriously. But if that's what you want, then every choice in Old is the wrong one. These mistakes are done with the consistency and calculation of somebody aware they don't work. And since he's so in tune with what doesn't work, he logically has to be in tune equally with what does for him to avoid it. But if he knows what would make the movie good, why elect to keep making such frustrating puzzles of ineptitude? The Sixth Sense may have been over 20 years ago, but it's a legitimate show of talent. You don't just make a movie that good and then name your character who's a rapper mid-sized sedan. It could be a dozen things truly motivating Shyamalan to make his films this way, but none of them make his movies watchable. Whatever's at the end of his amorphously self-aware rainbow is just not worth the journey there. There's an instinct in critics to enjoy opportunities to let loose on something with flaws that are not only massive, but incredibly self-evident. If I didn't enjoy mulling over the minutiae of what I personally value and artistically appreciate, I wouldn't do it. But if bad art must exist, sometimes it's nice to review something that's such a complete failure its grand flaws articulate in your head without any effort. I think this is why in my stint as a YouTube critic, the Kissing Booth movies and I are attached at the hip. Their flaws are so obvious, it's as if they're doing my job for me. The Kissing Booth 3 stands out even amongst the other ones, caught in an ever-dissipating plot structure. The first act is a 40-minute sequence of montages, and the third act basically does not exist, yet there is still movie there. It's so satisfying to point out the toxicity of the characters and their meaningless conflicts. By the third movie, I'm still noticing flaws that apply to all three that I'd never noticed before. It's like the Cornetto trilogy, but with details that make them worse. And these movies are bad. Abominably bad. Capital B Michael Jackson bad. And as targets for risk-free punching down, they all serve their purpose. Like an impersonal utilitarian product. Like a stepladder. But the trilogy is finally over. And hey, don't cry because it's over. Cry because it happened.
Dribble these cheeks, Bugs.
A baffling number of people ran to the defense of Space Jam 2 when it came out, which makes me think they didn't have a good enough grasp on other people's expectations. I'm sure there are some sad individuals who judge it for not being high art, and I too feel bad for them, but in general, people are just media literate enough to know it's regressive in every area which gave the original its appeal. Space Jam did not put itself on hold to shill every Warner Brothers product under the sun for over a third of its runtime. There's such a world of difference in what each movie's trying to do. It's the film's most infamous misgiving that Space Jam 2's more a piece of advertising real estate than a movie, but something less discussed I find an even bigger problem is the film just taking itself way too seriously. The first one never really interrupted itself with pathos, and yet the through line of A New Legacy is LeBron's strained relationship with his son more than it is Looney Tunes or basketball. At the end it pretends like they killed off Bugs Bunny and it's not a joke. By the time it starts using directly lifted footage from the films it's referencing, it's clear that Space Jam 2 lacks any effort whatsoever. There is no other thing to distract from its dystopian cross-promotion. At least Disney has panache with its hyper-corporate content culture. Space Jam 2 cuts so many corners it's a perfect sphere. There are Game Grumps animated YouTube videos drawn better than this. It's a crime how bad the soundtrack is by comparison. And things like the rap battle or the Goon Squad having superhero introductions are devices so pandering and stupid it's only matched by how jarringly they're inserted into the movie. Even the title, Space Jam: A New Legacy, is bad. They don't go to space, and it's not a direct sequel, so there is no preceding legacy for the events of this film to be a new one. Calling it A New Legacy makes less sense than calling it Space Jam 2. You're telling me they thought of setting the film inside the Warner Brothers computer servers, but not once thought of calling it Cyber Space Jam? That title was right there. You just had to think for 1 second and do this little thing that would make your product better, and you still didn't do it. It would have cost you nothing. They just had such an aversion to making a single part of this movie good because they don't care. This movie is closer to performance art about studio's contempt for the audience than it is an actual film. I am exhausted. Please don't make another movie like this ever again. And if you paid to see it, don't ever pay to see a movie like this again. There was ever only going to be one thing at the top of my list. Sometimes the worst movie of the year stands out in such a spectacular way you take the runner-up and wonder if an argument it should take the top spot even exists. Like even the most indulgent sophistry in the world couldn't come up with a defense for it. Could I possibly say Space Jam 2 is worse than Buck-Breaking? No. I don't think I could do that. At the expense of 2 months in extracurricular work, creating something I could be proud of, Tariq Nasheed, King Flex himself, saw my review and took it down with a false copyright strike. So what is probably my best video has now been lost to the void. As if it's not enough this movie's full of false, unfounded, hateful, and outright dangerous information to spread around. Like it's not about saying that anyone who's ever wanted human rights only did so to tear down someone else. Tariq is trapped in a violent zero-sum game approach to civil rights, surrounded by people who, in the time since this film came out, have gone on to suggest COVID was sent by God to punish Jewish people. It's a movie that feels like the bad guys are winning. Like any attempt you make to put a little good into the world doesn't mean anything. The hate other people hold on to is so much more impassioned and reaches farther than any act of goodwill ever could. Listening to Tariq Nasheed, independent of the medium hosting his rhetorical parasites, is a surefire way to make you think worse about the general state of the world. If you're like me, unpacking layer after layer of how exactly something like Buck-Breaking could exist is enough to reach outside the realm of film criticism and just make you more hopeless about everything. Is this movie really postmodern white supremacy looking back on itself through a spherical mirror, or just what Charlie Kirk thinks critical race theory is? Whatever it is the most piss and shit movie of the year. Also last year, probably this year, and the year after as well. But hey, we can only go up. So if you like these movies more than me, less than me, and you care to, please tell me. And as always, if you like not only words, but the way I arrange and then say them, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to me, Brian from the channel Brian. Thank you and goodbye.